morning and welcome. I know we got a little extra capacity in here today, so there's some additional seats on the side over here if we get some other folks that have come in. But thank you for being here this morning. Welcome. I want to introduce to you Reverend Dr. Jeff Kloha. He's an old friend, and as I said here, I say call him a colleague. He presently lives in Washington, D.C. How long ago was it that you retired from the Museum of the Bible?
Retired, yeah, about 6 months ago. Yeah.
Okay. So when Jeff turned in his notice at the Museum of the Bible, I learned of it through social media and contacted him thinking, well, it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. Let's see if we can bring him in and have him share some of this wisdom with us. I'm excited for you to get the chance to learn from him. I got the opportunity to do this through several classes at seminary and very much enjoyed him. You may not get the full Jeff because when he's got a room full of seminary students, and the doors are closed, he can call us names and things like that.
Only him.
He can send us for coffee. He would make me do that once in a while. And he'll do one of these things when he talks smarty to you, so watch for him to do that. You'll know and you'll understand. It's not that he has some kind of a nervous tick or something, it's just how he talks. Jeff got his PhD in 1 Corinthians from the University of Leeds in England. He served for a time as the provost of the seminary faculty at St. Louis Seminary after I had left there. Mm-hmm. Anything else I should add to this?
No, that's fine.
Susan here?
Yeah, she's in the back, yeah. Very back, yeah.
Jeff and Susan were members at the Fieldwork Church, where I served while I was a seminary student. We got to know them both, I think, as friends and as co-workers in the work of the gospel. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and I'll follow up with any questions, and I'll be taking the mic around if you have questions if we get to that point in the class. Yeah. So there you go.
So now I have time to tell stories about McReynolds, right? There's some doozies, as you can imagine, I tell you. Is this on okay?
I might have to do
higher. Is that better? No.
Put this one with the fuzzy on your tie right there, right under your. Should pick you up. Okay. We tested this too, but if you're the first service, we struggled in there.
I didn't know how to turn a switch on. I think so. Is that better? Better? Okay. I'll try to talk fairly loud. No. All right. Well, again, thanks for having me out, Kevin and Amy, known for a very long time, and I guess you passed the classes. You must have passed. I don't really remember that, but some people you just kind of let them leave. That works. But
they want them gone.
We want them gone. Just go. It's fine. So, no, thanks for the invitation to be out here. I think it's only my second time in Arkansas, maybe. So it's great to be out here. Beautiful part of the country, and didn't know you had all this beautiful scenery out here, and so great to be with you and share some time together. For today, I thought I'd just, with an hour, walk through a little bit on modern translations, how we got them, and a little bit, how to use a translation, right? Why do we have different translations, and how do we use them? So hopefully we can kind of cover this in about an hour. So I'll just ask, which translations do you prefer? What's your kind of go-to translation? King James, yeah, very popular. ESV is kind of the NIV, yeah, that's what this one is here on the racks. So that's a popular one, kind of a more readable style. Yeah, anybody have any? Those are kind of the big three, at least among Lutherans, right? Any others that float around that you really enjoy or read? Lutheran Study Bible. Well, we'll talk about that. Yeah, that's an ESV with notes, and I'll get to that kind of at the end here. I was actually on the committee when they selected that back in the day, and you probably don't know why they picked it, but we'll leave that aside. So that's what I want to get into today. Why do we have these different translations? And what I hope you get is not that one is better than the other, but that they're all actually really good translations. The most important thing is to understand how they're translating, and even more important, that you read them. Okay, that's kind of the most important thing. It's in English, for Pete's sake, right? Okay. So why is there a Bible? I'd like to start with that. Why do we even have a Bible? And I'm going to start off with, as Kevin mentioned, my graduate work, my academic work is in manuscripts. This is actually a Latin manuscript, not Greek, but it's a beautiful manuscript called the Lindisfarne Gospels, copied in about the year 800 in northern England, actually on an island off of northern England. Beautiful Irish, like the Book of Kells, this beautiful calligraphy, the intricate design, beautiful manuscripts. This is the beginning of John in Principio era, so in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God, right? Beautiful manuscript. What's more unique about it is that it's the first English translation ever produced. So about 100 years after they made this manuscript, and the text is not very good here, but someone came along and did a kind of a interlinear word-by-word translation of the Latin into Old English in about the year 900. So it's the first existing English translation that we have, long before Luther or Tyndale. And I like this little picture because, again, you probably can't make it out. I should have picked a high-res image, but this is the word evangelium, the word gospel in Latin, same word in Greek, euangelion. And they translated above it using, and I'll spell it out, Godspell, right? Godspell, which was a Broadway show from like 1972, right? Whatever you think of the show, there's a couple good songs. But I don't know if they knew what the Old English word was, but in Old English, it's putting together two words. So in Latin and in Greek, evangelium or euangelion means literally good message. Euangelion is a report or a message, good message. Okay, so a good story, right? Good news. In Old English, Godspell, two words. If you know German, gut, right? Good, and spell. We just had Halloween, so witches speak spells, right? But in Old English, spell was simply speaking or talking. So good speaking, God's spell, is what they knew the Old Latin meant in the 9th century, and they translated the word gospel. So we lost the D, and now we just say gospel, but the word actually means, in Old English, good news. Okay? So the good news is why there is a Bible, right? This good news message about Jesus Christ. There's the rest of the manuscript. So in the Gospel according to Mark, the very first words in the Gospel, he says, the beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. What Mark is saying is not, this is the first verse in this book. He's saying, I'm starting to tell you a story, a good story, a great story about what this person, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, did for us. All right? And then the 14 verses later, the very first words out of Jesus' mouth, the first red letters anywhere in the Bible, in verse 14. After the temptation, he goes out preaching, and he says, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of God is here, so now repent and believe in the good news. Right? So Jesus is going to tell the good news and bring into being the good news of what God is doing now through him. And then in Mark chapter 8, the first time Jesus predicts his death and resurrection, and this call to discipleship, he says, whoever saves his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and the good news will save it. Okay? So the good news, this gospel message, is what Jesus came to do and to bring and to speak, and that's why the Bible was written, right? To bring this good news message and to make it available to people. John does the same thing at the end of the Gospel according to John. He says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written, right? John picked these to write down, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Okay. So why is there a Bible? It's exactly for this reason, right? So that the good news could come to us, and that by believing we could have life in his name, right? So the Bible's not just a history book. It's not just a set of facts. It's not just a rule book or code book for life. In fact, in the first place, the primary purpose is to create faith in Jesus Christ. Right? That's why there's a Bible. And this is reflected in the very first Christian sermon ever preached. Acts chapter 2, Pentecost Sunday in Jerusalem. And it's a really fascinating verse because from the beginning, the Christian faith, the Christian message was intended to be for all people. And so the message had to be translated into every language, right? And just contrast this, for example, with say, the Quran, right? You guys familiar with the Quran, Islam, right? In Islam, if you read a translation of the Quran, you are not reading the Quran. You are reading an interpretation. The only way to read the Quran is to know Arabic and to read it in Arabic. Okay? Anything else is secondary and not necessarily right. Okay? It is not at all the Christian view. The Christian view was this message about Jesus Christ has to go to all people. And it's going to be made available in every language possible. So the first sermon that Peter preaches in Acts chapter 2, right, there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, so they're coming for the Feast of Pentecost, devout men from every nation under heaven, and at the sound of the disciples, this sound from the disciples, the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, right? The crowd was bewildered because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. Isn't that interesting, right? Peter and the apostles are speaking probably in Greek, maybe in Aramaic. We're not entirely sure. They could speak both, certainly. But there's sort of like this Google Translate going on immediately, and everybody is hearing it in their own language as they're speaking, whatever their native tongue is. And they're all amazed and astonished and saying, are not all these who are speaking, Galileans, right? They're from like Saskatchewan, right? They shouldn't, they just should know this stuff, right? I always use that because if I say like Montana, somebody gets mad at me. So they're from Canada somewhere, right? So they're just normal, simple fishermen people. They're from Galilee. They're from the backwaters, right? And how is it that we hear each of us, in his own native language? And then he goes through this list, and it's a really interesting list. In fact, we got this nice map here. So let's do the list. Parthians and Medes, right? So Parthia and Media were not even in the Roman Empire. That was in a whole different empire. They're over here, modern day. There's the map, Media. Good thing you put this out, Kevin. Right, they're way over here in the Parthian Empire. The Roman Empire ended right at the border of Judea. So they're not even in the Roman Empire, and they're hearing the gospel in their own language. Right, and then he goes around the list. Elamites from up here, residents of Mesopotamia, so now we're right here. Judea and Cappadocia, so Cappadocia, Judea, wow, it's all right here on the map. Pontus and Asia, so over here on modern-day Turkey. Phrygia and Pamphylia, we're still in Asia Minor here. Egypt, the parts of Libya belong to Cyrene, so now we're all on the coast of North Africa. Visitors from Rome, so all the way in the capital city, right? The entire known world is hearing the gospel in their own language. Cretans and Arabs, isn't that interesting? Cretans, right? The dumb people on Crete, you know that, right? And then the Arabs way down here, right? No clue whatsoever, right? But they're hearing the gospel message in their own tongues. We hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God. So from literally day one, the Christian message, the gospel message about Jesus Christ was intended to be heard by all people in their own language, right? From its beginning, Christianity, again, unique as a missionary religion. It didn't exist before in any religion. You had a religion, it was the religion of your people, right? The only way other people got your religion is if you conquered them, right? And defeated them and forced them. You saw this in the Old Testament. But Christianity is the first religion in history to say we're going to go out and tell people this message and bring them in. And so it had to be understood in people's own languages. So how is it passed down to get to this point of translation? Just a brief review, and I'm sure you're probably aware of this, but the Hebrew Bible, of course, the books of the Old Testament were written in Hebrew, a few sections in Aramaic, a few of the later sections. This is the Dead Sea Scrolls from the book of Isaiah, very famous scroll of Isaiah from about 100 BC, beautiful manuscript. The Hebrew Bible is actually translated into Greek already beginning about 150 BC. So as Jews spread around the Roman Empire, especially in places like Alexandria and Rome where they spoke Greek, they started to translate the Hebrew into Greek. And this is in fact, the Bible that the apostles used. When Paul quotes the Bible, he's actually quoting a translation of the Hebrew into Greek. Now, he certainly knew Hebrew because he was a rabbi, but he's quoting the Greek because that's what everybody knew. That's the translation everybody used. So Paul had no problem not quoting Hebrew to people. He was able to just use the everyday translation that they used. I don't tell students that because they had to learn Greek and Hebrew. I made them, we had to do that anyway. But translation is still okay. So here's an early Greek translation. This is a Psalter, Greek Psalms from about the year 200. A beautiful manuscript of the Psalms. The New Testament was written entirely in Greek, beginning probably around the mid-40s of the first century down through maybe the end of the first century. So shorter time period than the Old Testament, about 60 years, but everything written completely in Greek. And Greek, of course, was the language that everybody spoke in the Roman Empire of the day. It was the language of trade, the language of literature, the language of educated people, the language of everyday people. And so the message was written in what everybody could speak. It's sort of like if Jesus came today, everything would be in English because pretty much no matter where you go in the world, somebody's going to know English, right? It's kind of the lingua franca, right, of our day. But the Greek they used, interestingly, was not the real difficult literary Greek. It was the more, they call it Koine Greek or common Greek, the language of everyday people. It tends to be very simple, straightforward, not complicated. Of course, Kevin didn't think that, but very, very easy kind of Greek to read. Sorry, I'm just going to riff on you the whole time here. Yeah, so it works. You're sitting there. So even in the act of writing the New Testament, it was intended for everybody, not just the elites, not just the educated, but kind of at a newspaper level is maybe the way you would describe it, right? Or internet level. Well, no, let's not go there. That's a whole other thing. So as Christianity spread, and the kind of brown area here, darker brown area, is the Roman Empire in about 120 AD. And as Christianity spread, they started to do translations pretty much immediately. So the earliest translations into Latin started about the year 200, and those were made probably first in North Africa, which was a little more isolated from the East, and so Latin was the primary language rather than Greek. And then a second translation done probably in Rome at about the same time from Greek into Latin. And Greek and Latin are very similar languages, similar word order, even some similar words, so that was a fairly straightforward process. But about the same time, they translated from the Greek into Syriac, which is a derivative of Aramaic, language that Jesus and the disciples spoke, which is a derivative from Hebrew. So kind of the native language of the area. And the Syriac translation was done probably about, again, 200, maybe 225. A little more difficult to transfer Greek into Syriac because it's a different kind of language, but we're still able to do it. Coptic, which was another language, hieroglyphics. Coptic is kind of the later derivation of hieroglyphics. It's a spoken version of hieroglyphics. And the Coptic translation was done again about the year 200 in Egypt. Very large Christian community in Egypt early on. Then they did an Aramaic translation in the 3rd century. Armenian, way up here in the corner, was done in the year 405. They actually didn't have a written language in Armenia prior to this. It was all spoken. And so a scholar named Mesrop Mashtots created an alphabet of 40 letters and translated the Bible from Greek into Armenian, which they still use today. Basically the same Bible. Beautiful script and a very difficult language, but that was done in 405. Armenia, by the way, was the first fully Christian nation, the first to proclaim Christianity as its religion in 309. So long before Constantine, or at least 15 years before Constantine made it legal. And then the main religion about 80 years later. Armenia was the first Christian nation. Ethiopic in Ethiopia, they translated in about 500 AD. The Slavic languages like Gothic, and I think I got one more up here. Yeah, Slavonic, were done in the 7th and 8th centuries as the gospel spread. So again, as Christianity grows, they're translating as they go. They're bringing the language, the Bible, into the language of everyday people. So again, missionary language, everybody to understand. I'm going to skip over the dates of the books here. We don't really need to cover that. Now, at the same time, of course, as they're doing translations, the Jewish community is continuing to copy the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew all throughout. And here's a beautiful 10th century Pentateuch manuscript. You can actually see this at Museum of the Bible. There's one of only 4 this old in the world, but beautiful manuscript in Hebrew. And what's fascinating about what they did in Hebrew, beginning about the year 800, they were so concerned about the accuracy of the text. They believed it was the Word of God and the verbatim Word of God, so they didn't want to lose anything, and they didn't want to have it mispronounced. Hebrew doesn't have any vowels, or at least just a couple of vowel markers, so they invented a system. You see all these little dots and dashes? Invented a system to put symbols around the consonants so you learned how to pronounce the words correctly. And so people would learn how to chant from these, and they would memorize the words of the Torah if you were going to be a rabbi. They would also count the number of letters in each book to make sure that they had exactly the right number at the end. And they would have these little notes at the end of each book. Here's how many letters in the book. Here's the middle letter of the book, so you had to count backwards and forwards to make sure. These people had a lot of time on their hands, right? They didn't have cell phones back then, right? They needed something to do. So it's crazy stuff. And the Hebrew text that we use today is identical to, literally, letter by letter, exactly what they were using 1,000 years ago, which again goes back to the Dead Sea Scrolls 1,000 years before them. So amazing with the Hebrew text. Now the Greek text, the Greek Orthodox Church, really a continuation of the Roman Empire, and the church in the East lasted until the conquest by the Turks in 1451. But they were continuing to copy in Greek. Now they changed the style of writing and the letters and things like that, but same Greek text. This one's from the 11th century? Yeah, 11th century, Gospel according to Matthew. Beautiful script. There's today roughly 5,500 manuscripts, handmade copies of parts of the New Testament around the world today. So again, they're using the same text they were using in 100, 200, 300, passing it down generation to generation. So this is what seminary students do: is they learn the Greek and the Hebrew and learn to read it on their own, so they don't have to rely on translation, or can help evaluate translations. But you had both going on, right? The missionary work of translating for all people, and also the preserving of the Greek and Hebrew in those communities that still use those languages. And they still use this today. I got to attend a liturgy in Constantinople a couple years ago. You think our services are bad? It happened to be like the biggest Greek festival of the year. They call it the restoration of the icons, because in the 9th century icons were banned and then they were restored, so that's their kind of big day. It's like Reformation Day for them. And you have to stand for the whole thing. So they gave me a place where you can like lean against something and like this. But they said, yeah, we'll come get you after about an hour and a half, and we'll have some coffee, and then after the services we'll have our meetings. And so they started at 8:30, came and got me at about 10, and they finished up at about 1:30. Yeah, so they were standing and chanting the entire time, which is great. Good for them. Wouldn't work here. Yeah. I'm not telling Kevin to do this. Yeah. All right. Please rise. Yeah. So things change dramatically when we get to the Middle Ages. Okay. In the Middle Ages, literacy increased, learning increased. There was an interest in education, interest in personal advancement economically and professionally, and a need for greater access to copies of the Bible. So the first book printed with movable type, you're probably aware, is the Gutenberg Bible from 1455. Still printed in Latin, and it looks exactly like a Latin manuscript from the 15th century, because Gutenberg, of course, he's a businessman. He wants to sell copies so he can make money, and so he's printing these large format, very impressive books, trying to mass produce them and sell them to basically to monasteries and churches and essentially wealthy people. The cost of a Gutenberg Bible in the 1450s was about a year's salary for a Medici banker in Florence. So you know, the big bank in Florence, the Medicis, it's like the Wall Street of the day. So how much does a Wall Street banker make today? Probably too much money, right? That's how much a Gutenberg Bible cost. So you and I would not have had a Gutenberg Bible, you know. And he produced about 160 or 180 of these. About 55 still remain, which is a very high percentage. Because what people did, of course, they're beautiful and expensive, and they bought them and they wouldn't let anybody touch them because they're too expensive, right? And so these got preserved, and there's several just beautiful copies around the world. But again, it's a technological advancement, but it's still just kind of continuing at the time this Bible accessible only to a few. Okay, people could not read it for themselves. Translation started to be done shortly afterward. So Martin Luther is famous. We'll talk about his in 1522, but there were actually 18 translations from the Latin into German before Martin Luther. So here's an example of one from 1485, produced in Strasbourg. By the end of the 14th or 15th century, by 1500, there are translations into French, and German, and Dutch, Italian, all kinds of languages, as there's more interest in people having access to the Bible. Okay. So when they translate, what were they doing? And one downside of these translations is, again, they're not yet really understanding how to go from one language to another. Not a lot of reflection on that or interaction with that process. And so the translations, even though it might be in German, still sounded basically like Latin, right? And if you read the King James, if it's not familiar to you, there's a lot of words that they just kind of brought from Latin into English, right? It kind of doesn't really work in English sometimes. You don't know what it means. It's kind of what it was like to read in an old German or French translation. It still sounded kind of Latin and not really the kind of language everyday people spoke, right? So here's the kind of styles of translation you had in the ancient world up to the 16th century. Some translations will tend to be more word focused. So if there's one Hebrew word, we're going to use one English word, right? And that kind of sounds pretty stilted, right? It's not a very flowing translation. The word order is different. We'll use sometimes several words for one word and those kinds of things. So some translations like the old Syriac or some of the later Jewish translations into Greek tended to be very much like that, right? One Hebrew word, one Greek word, or one Syriac word, and more really kind of study resources than reading resources, right? Other translations, like the Latin Vulgate, Jerome translated from Greek and Hebrew into Latin in the late 4th century, beginning in about 380. And his desire was to actually create a commonly available language. So Vulgate in Latin means common, and his Latin is a very simple Latin. It's not very complex. It's not like classical Latin. And so his was called the common translation. Very effective in the 4th century, but then they didn't change it for 1,000 years. And by the time you got to the 15th century, nobody could read it anymore, unless you were educated and a lawyer or a clergyman or something like that. Actually, most clergy couldn't read either, for that matter. So you had this range, right? Some translations try to get the meaning more, and so maybe we'll use different words or more words, less words to communicate. Others are more word focused. We're going to go word by word by word. And to put this, I'll show this later on, but in a modern framework, something like the ESV is kind of more on this end of the scale, right? It's a little more trying to match the old style rather than a more flowing English. And something like the NIV is a little bit more kind of on this end of the scale, right? Trying to capture the English more than trying to match up with the Greek and Hebrew, right? So the same kind of questions that we have today about translation and how to do it are the same things they're trying to do in the ancient world, and there's different styles. So why translation, and how difficult is translation? And I don't want to belabor this too much, but you know, Google is making it much easier, of course. But have you ever tried to take a document or go to a website and try to read in a different language, and then like it makes no sense, right? I mean, eventually AI will fix everything, right? But it's not that easy, right? It's not a simple computer process to go one by one. And going from one language, one culture to another is very difficult. And I'll give you a couple kind of fun modern examples. And I always hate to use political examples, but I will anyway. So back when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, right? They wanted to, she had this big theme. They were going to reset relations with Russia. So they had their, their people translate the word reset from Russian or from English into Russian, and they came up with this word which I cannot pronounce, Veragruska, whatever, which the State Department thought meant reset, but apparently in Russia actually means explode. So that one didn't work out too well. Not a good idea. We know how that worked out. Languages that are very different from each other, of course, hard. This is go to China. Yeah. Yeah, and you know what happens, right? It means handicap rest area, right? So they translate that into Chinese and then back translate it from Chinese into English, and you get deformed man end place, right? So, yeah, whatever they do in China with those people, it's probably not a good thing. Or, and this is very common. This is Hindu temples you cannot wear feet into. Muslim prayer halls you can't wear shoes into. Seen the same signs in Istanbul. Foot wearing prohibited. Yeah, so foot wearing prohibited, like chop your feet off before you come in. What does that mean, right? Strictly, again, they mean footwear prohibited, but foot wearing of feet things, right? Well, here's even English, right? So Kevin mentioned we did our PhD in England, and our girls were real small; they were like tiny. And so we saw these signs everywhere. They thought these were hilarious, right? Humped, and in Britain they say humped zebra crossing. Okay. So what you get to a street and it's like, where's the humped zebras, right? Well, what they mean is you see the little dashes across the road here. It's a crosswalk, which they call a zebra crossing in England, and it's got a speed bump over it, so it's a humped zebra crossing, right? To Brits, it doesn't mean anything. To Americans, it's like, where's, we're at the zoo? They find some new animal, right? It's English, but because we're in a different culture, we don't exactly know what it means, right? So there's all these decisions. Actually, it came up today in the gospel reading where the widow puts in 2 coins, right? And the ESV said something like she put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. And the Greek is actually she put in 2 lepta, which is a quadrans. And what Mark is doing is a lepta is the Jewish coin, and he's translating it into what the Roman coin is, a quadrans. So he's going from Jewish culture to Roman culture because his audience is Gentile, and they know what a quadrans is, but they don't know what a lepta is. So we it's meaningless in English. It kind of doesn't matter, right? But they've kind of, what would you do, right? The 2 shekels, which is a penny. How do you bring that? And even at the end, she put in her, what did it say? Well, here the ESV has, she put in everything, all she had to live on, which is probably what it means. But the Greek says she put in her entire life. Yeah. So again, you're making choices. How do you move from one culture to another? And so some things get lost in translation. Now, beginning in the 16th century, there was this rekindling of the desire of the gospel to be in everybody's language. That it wasn't just for the educated people or for the clergy, but everybody should get access to the Word of God, just like we had at Pentecost and the early church. And one of the leading proponents of this was actually, kind of ironically, a Roman Catholic. There's a Catholic scholar named Erasmus of Rotterdam, a phenomenal scholar, one of the greatest scholars of the Bible ever, who printed the first printed Greek edition of the New Testament, wrote a commentary that Luther used, still useful today actually. It's a very, very excellent analysis of the Greek. But he produced this new tool, this edition of the Greek New Testament. He actually didn't call it a Greek New Testament or a New Testament. He called it a new tool, a new instrument was his title. And his purpose was to provide an accurate Greek text so that it could be translated into all kinds of languages. So here's what he says in his preface, a beautiful preface. He said, the Son belongs to everyone. The science or the study of Christ is just the same. I'm totally opposed to the fact that divine scripture should not be translated into one's native language to be read by the non-clergy, as if Christ's teaching was so mysterious that only a handful of theologians could understand it, or as if the fortress of religion was built with the ignorance which the church has forced on the common man. I wish that even the lowliest woman, would read the Gospels and the Pauline epistles. And I would that they were translated into all the languages so that they could be read not only by the Scots and Irish, no offense, but in the, those are like the real dumb people out there at the end of the world, no offense, He's Italian, give him a break, or he's Dutch, give him a break, right? He says, so read not only by the Scots and Irish, but also by the Turks and the Saracens, right? Even the heathens should be able to read the gospel in their own language. And so with that, as a result, the farmer sings some portion of them at the plow. The weaver hums some parts of them to the movement of his shuttle. The traveler lightened the weariness of the journey with stories from this source, right? He wanted to do so every person in their everyday lives would memorize and know the scriptures. Those beautiful images of the farmer at the plow, the weaver at the shuttle. Luther quotes exactly that when he talks about translation. And William Tyndale, the one who did the first English translation from Greek into English, quotes exactly that because they're using this New Testament to do their translation. So it wasn't just a Protestant thing in the 16th century. There were others who realized that the Word of God should be read in everyone's language. You might have heard that it was illegal to translate the Bible before the Reformation. I mean, that's not actually true. As I mentioned, there were 18 translations into German before Luther. And in fact, there were French translations, especially of the Psalms from the 12th century, English translations of the Psalms from the 12th century. The problem came is if you translated the Bible and then said the Bible was more right than the Pope. That's when you got into trouble, right? You translate the Bible, and if you left it at that, fine. But if you said the Bible now is read by everybody and can judge doctrine, like Erasmus says here, and is more important than the Pope, that's when you got into trouble. So that's why Wycliffe, who did an English translation in the 14th century, got into trouble, said Bible more than Pope. They killed him, right? Jan Hus, same thing in Bohemia. Bible more important than the Pope, they killed him. And why Luther had to go into hiding, right, to make the Bible accessible to all people. Okay, so beginning with this in the 16th century, this movement to kind of recapture the idea, the biblical idea, that everybody should be able to read the Bible. So why are there so many translations? And just a couple of observations here. First, your translation theory. Okay. So are you translating to match your recipient language, and so it's understandable and clear to them? Or are you translating to be more, quote, accurate to the Greek and Hebrew, or more connected to the Greek and Hebrew? Okay. Luther took the opinion, and pretty much every translation since follows this, that the language should be or the Bible should be in the language of everyday people. The reason his translation was more successful than others was not because he was the first to market, but because he translated in very simple German. Almost no word in Luther's translation is bigger than 2 syllables. It's very simple, very straightforward. Even if you know a tiny bit of German, you can still read it today if you get the characters translated. It's very easy German. And it was kind of revolutionary, right? I mean, the old, I'm sure we got some Germans here, right? What language did God speak? Obviously German, right? Because first words God speaks, right? Adam, wo bist du? Right? Adam, where are you? Right? In the garden. He's speaking German, right? Of course he did, right? Germans are only a little arrogant. But you notice that Adam, wo bist du? That's like the easiest German you could possibly do, right? I could even memorize it, right? So it's so easy. That's what Luther did. Mary didn't speak like a saint, like she does in the Vulgate. She speaks like a normal German peasant woman, which is pretty remarkable in the 16th century. Okay. So, and when translations are done today to bring the Bible for the first time into modern languages for people who don't know it, they very much follow this approach, that it should be, first of all, understandable for people in their own native language. And we shouldn't try to make them learn Greek and Hebrew before they can read the Bible in their own language, right? Kind of makes sense. The other reason we have, so that's why you have different styles of translation or different translations. The other reason is because there's changes in English all the time, and it's just accelerated really in our own time. Vocabulary changes, things like inclusive language comes up, and there's all kinds of debates about that, but I can tell you anybody under the age of 25 hears he is a male, right? And mankind is males. Right? It's just the way language works today. We also have advances in scholarship. So when they translated the King James, there were excellent scholars who did it, and it's a very good translation for what they had in the early 17th century. But we know much more now archaeologically. We know much more culturally about what things were. We know what words meant, that they didn't know what they meant there. That's why they just brought them from Latin into English, because they weren't quite sure what they meant. But now we know what they mean because we have more resources. So as more discoveries are made, as languages are refined, then new translations are produced to reflect these. And to some extent for different audiences. I have no issue with people reading King James, but again, are you translating for people who grew up with that, or for people who maybe have never read the Bible before? It's a very different audience, a very different goal for a translation. And to some extent, different manuscripts. I won't get a whole lot into this, but when Erasmus did his edition in 1516, he only had 5 Greek manuscripts, and all of them were from the 11th to the 12th century. Today we have, like I said, 5,500 Greek manuscripts, some of which go back to the late 2nd century. So they're 1,000 years older than what Erasmus had, and they're more accurate. So modern translations will use the older manuscripts, and slight changes, which I'll show you an example of. And the last reason is because we live in America and people try to sell Bibles. So, so it cracks me up, right? #1 best-selling student Bible. It's the Bible, for Pete's sake, and you're talking about it like, or 5 million sold, so it must be the best. It's like, really? It just blows my mind that we just use marketing for, anyway, it's fine. All right, so translation theory. As I mentioned, there's in the ancient world different styles of translation, and we see this today. So if you're familiar with the New American Standard Bible, it was done, I think, first in the 60s, maybe early 70s. And that tried to be painfully close to the Greek and Hebrew, like almost unreadable. And I could tell when students didn't really do their translation work at seminary, it would sound something like the NASB because they probably looked it up in the NASB and memorized it, right? Now that could be useful, right? It could be useful as a kind of a reference tool. If you read something or read 2 translations and are a little bit different, if you go to the NSB, it'll tell you sort of as close as you can get in English to what the literal, Greek and Hebrew was. So it's useful for that, but if you try to read chunks of it at a time, you're probably not going to get very far because it's not really English. It's more, Latin or Hebraicized English. The ESV and the King James tend to be in that direction, do you read the ESV in worship? Yeah. It kind of works because it's similar to the King James, and many of us are familiar with that. And it's related to the RSV, which is done in 1952, kind of an update of the King James. So for a long time, church members, it works because it's familiar. But again, for people who have no history with the Bible, it can be a little bit stilting, right? It doesn't flow very easily. It's not as clear English as other translations, and sometimes it's really hard to read out loud, actually. Kevin never has a problem, but it can be hard to read. NIV and the NET, New English Translation, tend to be a little bit more middle. And then translations like the Contemporary English Version or the New Living Translation, you familiar with these? These tend to be more done, they're recent in the last really 20 years, but kind of when you bring the Bible into a foreign language for the first time, this would be aiming for that more, trying to bring it as if you're kind of coming into English for the first time, for a native speaker and trying to make it as understandable as possible. And I have to say, I used to be more along the lines of, yeah, let's stick with more Greek and Hebrew, but I don't know, these actually are much more readable. And you can read more because you're not working so hard just to kind of translate it in your head, even as you're reading English, right? Now, it tends to be a bit more, not really a paraphrase, but a little more long-handed. And so sometimes you might want to go back and check, well, let's see what the ESV does or the NASB and where are they kind of, splitting things off here a little bit. But for just kind of reading, it's actually a pretty good translation. Now, the Message, if you're familiar with that, that's kind of almost a category unto itself. It was done by Gene Peterson, a really tremendous scholar, very gifted writer, and he did a rendering of the New Testament, but it's not really a translation. It's kind of an interpretation as he goes. And so there's some passages that are just not even close. And he tends to be a little bit, shall we say, I don't know, I hate to use liberal conservative, but he's kind of, some difficult passages he tends to gloss over, right? So I really wouldn't encourage this, especially as your only Bible. It's a good interpretation if you want to get his take on it, which is often pretty good, not always, but it's helpful. But the CEV or the NLT are probably better for just a readable English translation. Now, what things are kind of lost in translation? What makes translation difficult? What are the choices translators have to make? And then I'll skip ahead. Well, one challenge is that there are some things you simply can't translate, especially literary devices or artistic devices in the Greek and the Hebrew. I mentioned in the first service, that the Apostle Paul is from Chicago and very sarcastic. The prophet Isaiah also is very sarcastic. Probably even worse than Paul. So Isaiah, of course, he's sent to preach to the tribe of Judah that God is going to judge them and there's nothing they can do, right? And so he really lays into it thick. And here in chapter 58, he says, is this the fast that I choose, a day for a person to humble himself, right? Is that I'm saying just do a day and be done with it? And in English, it sounds bad enough, but in Hebrew, the words are very similar. He says, is this the tzom that I choose, just a yom, right? You see tzom, yom, right? It's called sarcasm, right? Yeah, will you call this a tzom, just a yom acceptable to the Lord, right? Now, there's no way you can translate because the English word for day and the English word for fast don't sound at all alike. So you just kind of lose that, right? And that's why you kind of have to learn Greek and Hebrew so you can pick up on these kinds of things. Another example is Psalm 22, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from me? Do you hear my words of groaning? That's what almost every English translation does, but the Hebrew is it's poetry, and it sounds anguish because there's no verbs. It actually says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Far from me, words of my groaning. You get the sense that this person struggling is just barely getting words out of his mouth, and it's a very emotional thing. But in English, they chose to kind of make it into longhand, and you lose that poetic effect, right? So these are, choices that are being made in translation. Yeah.
How about when Saul was 1 year old when he became king?
And the translation issue there?
No, not at all.
Oh.
Well, yeah, but at the NIV, it's got brackets around it. They put that he was 30 years old.
Oh, 1 year old, yeah, after his age, yeah, things like that. Yeah. Yeah, because numbers for letters, yeah, or letters for numbers, exactly. Yeah. So again, it's not that you're going to lose the meaning here. It's that there's subtleties that you can't bring into a modern language. They just kind of don't work. John does this a lot. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The light shined in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, is what the English usually says. But the word in Greek can actually mean overcome or conquer, master, right? The darkness has not mastered it. So they didn't understand it, and they didn't conquer it, right? Both at the same time. In the Gospel of John, there's about a dozen of these where he uses a Greek word that can mean two things, and it kind of means both, right? It's a play on words. Nicodemus, right? How can a man be born again? The Greek word anothen can be translated born again a second time or born from above, right? And so Nicodemus is confused, but then when Jesus explains it, right, unless you are born from the Spirit, right, you cannot have life. So he means from above, and Nicodemus thinks he means born again, but the confusion is caused by the single Greek word that can mean both. So you get this a lot of times in John, where he kind of plays with that. And this is where a study Bible, again, can be helpful. It gives you kind of these notes. Let me skip ahead, and because I tend to just ramble on here. Yeah, I get it. Yeah, it's all good. So let's talk about kind of using a Bible and bestseller. I still find it, again, I mentioned this, but kind of inappropriate to talk about, well, the Bible is the best-selling book of all time. Right? I mean, okay, that's factually true, but we understand why that is. Actually, one digression here, the first time the Bible became a bestseller was actually Luther's translation in 1522. He did the "Here I Stand, I Shall Do No Other," right? And they carried him off and kind of hid him in a castle, so the Holy Roman Emperor couldn't find him and kill him. And he used the time to translate from Greek into German. He did his translation in about 3 months. It's amazing. Just sat down and cranked it out. And the reason he was in a hurry to get it done is because the book fair in Mainz was coming up, and his printer wanted to have copies to take to the book fair. So he finished the translation. They rushed it off to Wittenberg. They set up a special printing press just to print copies of this New Testament. They got it done and printed about 5,000 copies, took it to Mainz, and it sold out immediately. Partly because everybody knew Luther was going to say something about the Pope, right? So it's a little bit scandal. But it was the first time that the Bible was that readily accessible in that quantity and kind of sold out immediately. So the cost of a Luther Bible when it came out in 1522 was about a half a pig, just for comparison's sake. So half a pig was about the cost of a Bible. So a little more affordable, right? You had to have a pig and chop, I don't know, it's just a translation. But it was so popular, there were, was it 11 or 13 pirated versions of Luther's New Testament before the end of 1522 in 3 months. And they did a second edition in December, and it was so popular that even the Catholic scholars took his translation and changed a few things and reprinted it. Didn't call it Luther's, but they kind of changed the things they liked. Yeah, so hugely popular and really went on to standardize the German language. Same thing in English. William Tyndale was an admirer of Luther, actually traveled to Wittenberg to talk to Luther in Melanchthon, and did his translation really in exactly the same style as Luther. Very simple English, simple words, and even translated Luther's prefaces from the New Testament, included them in his translation. And that was banned. Henry VIII was Catholic at that point. He didn't divorce his wife yet. And so it was banned, and there's only a partial copy left of the original printing. They were all destroyed. And eventually Tyndale was tracked down and murdered for going against the church. But same style. And Tyndale's translation was just a stunningly beautiful translation. The King James, about 60% of the King James is just William Tyndale, slightly updated. It's a very successful translation. Blessed are the poor in spirit, that's Tyndale. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, that's Tyndale. All this stuff is Tyndale. So what are the top-selling, most popular translations, at least as of 2020, right? So NIV is number 1. King James still up there, number 2. NLT I mentioned. ESV down a little bit. New King James. New American Standard still makes about the top 10, but pretty familiar. The Reina Valera is the Spanish translation. Still a very popular translation. The Message makes its way onto the list again. But of course, we're in an LCMS church, so this is the translation. Okay. Now, so how do you use a Bible like this? Just kind of briefly. And I'm a fan of study Bibles, actually. And personally, I would suggest you have 2 at least 2 Bibles. One that's just the text that you can read and not have all kinds of distractions with it, but something that's readable to you, right? If it's King James, great. If it's CEV, great, right? Whatever it is. But then a second Bible that has the notes and the helps and the cross references. And, so when you come across something you don't quite understand, or what are they saying here, or what's that cultural context, the footnotes will help you kind of get that, and then you can go back and keep reading. So I encourage you to have kind of both, and the Lutheran Study Bible is good. But here's what you got to keep in mind. All right, so here's 1 Corinthians 8 and 9 from the Lutheran Study Bible. And keep in mind that you got about 40% of the page is Bible and 60% of the page is not Bible. Okay, so this is somebody's interpretation. Now, I happen to think it's a great interpretation because I wrote it, yeah, but it's very good. But so that's why I use this page. But it's still just what I said, and it's my interpretation. Of course, it's right, Kevin? Yeah, but it's still just my interpretation. So helpful, but just keep in mind what it is, right? And that's all it is. So when you get to the biblical text, even here you've got helps added. So you're not reading Bible, you're reading helps, which again is fine, but just be aware of what it is. So all these chapter headings, Paul surrenders his rights. Well, somebody said, well, that's what this chapter is about, I'm going to add it here. Not a single manuscript in Greek, Latin, Armenian, anything has a heading like that. That was added in the 20th century as a help, so you can track your way through. Sometimes they're good, sometimes not. The Study Bible adds a helpful date. Paul wrote this letter in 55, maybe early 56, but it gives you a chronological date for the book. Again, helpful, but no manuscript has that information, right? That's a scholarly deduction made much later on. Down here, you've got alternative translations. Again, very helpful. Here's another way to translate this word, or maybe a more literal way to translate that word. Again, helpful, but not in a manuscript. Even quotation marks. Greek and Hebrew don't have quotation marks. And sometimes it matters, right? So here, Paul is kind of refuting the people in Corinth who said, we're going to do whatever we want. I don't care what Paul says or anybody. And so he quotes their sort of bumper sticker slogans and then refutes it. So he says, therefore, as to eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, right? And that there is no God but one. Now, those are in quotes because we now know that those were what the people in Corinth were saying to Paul as to why they should be able to eat the food sacrificed to an idol. So Paul quotes it and then refutes it. So you have to put it in quotes because it's not Paul's teaching, it's their own teaching. Right? You see that? So Greek doesn't do that. You have to kind of figure that out from context and historical factors. All the parallel passages, again, helpful, but added to the text. All the punctuation marks, all the verse numbers. Verse numbers were not part of any text of the Bible until 1551. First time a Greek Bible had the verse numbers, and then they got picked up into other translations. Chapter numbers were added in the 11th century, so they're older, but again, they were kind of more chunks of material, and that sometimes they break up the context a little too much. They're not really rhetorical, they're more, convenience. Page numbers, right? Book numbers, chapters, all that added later on. So just keep in mind, again, these are all helpful, but the Bible is actually only the stuff in black and white, and the other stuff is things to help us along. Okay. So again, I'd encourage you to have a couple translations, one that's readable and as clean as possible, that you just kind of read through. And in fact, a trend in Bible translation today is to produce translations without verse numbers at all, or chapter numbers. So it looks more like a novel, and you can sit down and read a novel for a half hour, 45 minutes, and so they try to make the Bible look like that because that's how it used to look, and you can read longer chunks at a time. The Luther confessions don't have verse numbers because those are 1551. So in Luther, the confessions quote the Bible. They'll say, well, as it says in John 3, and then you just quote the verse, right? And you're supposed to be able to find it because you're supposed to have John 3 memorized and know where it is, right? Even older than that, before chapter numbers, the pastors and theologians would just say, well, as John says, and then quotes the verse. And they assume, again, you know where it is. You know how to find it, right? A little harder for us today because we're more distracted, but again, the familiarity with the text is the key. So how do you evaluate, and I'll kind of end with this, evaluating a translation. First, again, recognize that translation is very difficult. There's choices being made no matter what you do. And it's not that they do things wrong, they're just making choices for the audience or for the goals that they have for the translation. It's impossible to perfectly match the Greek and Hebrew in every subtlety, again, because shades of meaning might differ, the cultural setting is different, word plays, things like that. And again, it's still worth, if you want to learn Greek and Hebrew, you can do it online now. It's not that hard. It's easy, right? Third, no translation is absolutely perfect. I don't even know what the word perfect would mean, even though every translation, of course, claims to be so because they want to sell more copies, right? Because we're in America. There is always interpretation involved in translation. And again, that's why it's helpful to have a couple translations, something with some notes to help you along. And then last, this is there's some debate on this, right? Language changes, so should we change our translations, right? I grew up with the RSV when I was little, and then we switched to the NIV, and now we're on our ESV. So it's like, what am I quoting? And sometimes it's a mishmash, and sometimes I have it memorized better in Greek than I do in English, right? So it can get confusing, right? It's like the catechism. They changed the catechism translation, and I don't know which one I quote anymore. Right? It's probably not right on any of them. Who knows? Again, it's what are your goal, right? If it's comfortable for you, if it makes sense to you, go ahead and do it. When I was a pastor in Cleveland, we used the NIV. And my first Christmas, I remember Christmas Eve, I got up for the first Christmas Eve service and read the NIV, right? For, in the days of Caesar Augustus, a decree went out that the entire Roman, whatever it was in the NIV, it didn't sound like Christmas, right? So the second service, I pulled out the King James and read it from the King James, and it made sense, right? Because that's what I grew up with, and it sounded more dignified, and that's what, that's what Linus quotes in Charlie Brown Christmas, right? So it has to be right? So there's a point to be made, right? It's good to keep a consistent translation for memorization, but again, for somebody new to the faith or new to the Bible, it might be good to have something that they can just read and understand on their own, and we shouldn't force it on them, kind of a thing. But the most important point is the last one. And again, this goes back to why is there a Bible at all? The question is, does it make Christ clear to you? Right? Do you hear the word of Christ as you read that translation? Does it make sense? Is it clear? Is the gospel coming through? Right? And if it does, keep reading it. If it's not clear, if it's not making sense, get another translation, right? Go on the internet, they're free. BibleGateway.com, they got like 80 translations on there. Find one that makes sense and that you get drawn into and keep on reading, keep on reading, keep on reading. Because if we're not reading it, it's not doing any good. Right? It's not doing the purposes for which God gave it. So I'll close with this. A couple of quotes, one from Luther. This is on his treatise on translation, actually. He said, "You should diligently learn the word of God and by no means imagine that you know it. Let him who is able to read take a psalm in the morning or some other chapter of scripture and study it for a while. This is what I do. When I get up in the morning, I pray and recite the 10 Commandments, the Creed, and the Lord's Prayer with the children, adding any one of the Psalms. I do this only to keep myself well acquainted with these matters, and I do not want to let the mildew of the notion grow that I know them well enough. The devil is a greater rascal than you think he is. You do not as yet know what sort of fellow he is and what a desperate rogue you are. His definite design is to get you tired of the word and in this way to draw you from it. This is his aim." So Luther, just read it, right? Get up in the morning, Lord's Prayer, right? Apostles' Creed, and read some Bible, right? Don't pretend you already know it, right? Don't leave it up to your pastor to read it for you on Sunday morning, right? That's good, but it's not enough, right? Or this is one of my favorite prayers, and maybe it's probably familiar. Maybe we could pray this together. It's a prayer written by Thomas Cranmer for the Book of Common Prayer in 1662, but we've adapted it into our Lutheran liturgy, and now it's kind of part of our liturgy. And so let's pray this together. Blessed Lord, who has caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant that we may in such wise hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that by patience and comfort of thy holy word we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life. Amen. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, it nails it exactly, right? Read. Actually, the old Book of Common Prayer said, hear, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, right? So you hear them and they get digested, right? Isn't that a beautiful image? Patience and comfort of your word may we embrace and hold fast the everlasting hope, or blessed hope of everlasting life. Right? Exactly what it's for. So beautiful prayer. And maybe we got 3 minutes for questions. Kind of ran on. Yeah. So Semitic languages in the ancient world were, and even ancient Greek was left to right. And then Romance languages are, am I doing that right? Left to right. Hebrew is right to left, right? They're not sure why. It's most people are right-handed, and it's easier to write this way than that way if you're right-handed. So that might be the reason. But there wasn't any, there was no reason given. It's just this family of languages in this direction, this in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I understand right, there was the Bible came out, it was the NIV, and they republished it, and they named the new edition the NIV too.
Yeah, they've actually, and this is that challenge of do you keep updating the Bible? And so the first NIV was, I think, in the early 70s. And then they did a revised NIV. They did an NIV 2000. Then they did recently an NIV, I don't know what it is now, but now they're putting a year on it. And I think what their aim is, their view is, we want the language to be as readable for this generation. So they keep updating. And again, it makes it more readable, or you pick up on some things maybe, but you lose the continuity of a single translation. So that's just the choice the NIV people made, and they keep doing it. The ESV's been updated a couple times, by the way. The one that's in the study Bible was changed, and I don't think they updated the study Bible. I think it still reflects the older translation. But it's kind of minor things. It's just a handful of little things. So again, that's just the view of the people who produce the Bible. Should it stay the same, or should they update it kind of as each change comes along? The RSV's been updated about 5 or 6 times now. They just did a new one about 2 years ago. Yeah. They're going to run out of names pretty soon.
We'll take one more.
I was just interested. My favorite version is the NIV.
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing ESV because we can't say no to this guy forever. Anyway.
I can help you with that.
Anyway, I'm wondering, is the choice of what translation that you ever made, in your opinion, for totally political reasons?
Everything is politics, right? So I wasn't on the committee, but I wrote the kind of study document in, I don't know what year it was, like 2001 or something, for evaluating translations that would eventually end up in a new hymnal. And the ESV had just come out, so I had to do a second version along the way. And I actually don't remember what I recommended at that point. I should look it up. I probably still have the file. But should I say this? So the reason, and you got to understand, there's costs, there's marketing, all these kinds of things. The reason they picked the ESV rather than NIV or something else was because one reason was they were allowed to use it without paying for it, for one thing. And second, they were allowed to do some adaptations to certain places that the other translations wouldn't let them do. So it gave them a little more flexibility and reduced some costs, and it was a good translation. It's not like it's wrong again, but there's always multiple factors going into when you decide to use a translation. So it's fine. The Catechism now has the ESV in it, so for consistency's sake, it might be good to do that. But don't feel like it's the only one you can use, or for personal reading or things like that. Yeah. So there's always, again, like everything else, there's multiple reasons, and they're all valid reasons. Right. Yeah.
I want to say thank you to Jeff for being with us today. If you're not, thank you for supporting him and coming here. We're sort of footing the bill for him to be here. So, but it's a pleasure to have somebody of this caliber here with us amongst us. And I appreciate you guys all coming in, and I appreciate you and Susan coming.
Thank you. Yeah.
Being part of it. So thank you. All right, we'll see you in church if we have the chance. He's not already been.